Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. It began before sunrise on a Sunday, June 22nd, 1941. Along a frontier stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the horizon lit up with artillery fire. 3 million German soldiers moved at once, engines growling across fields still wet with dew. It was called Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's gamble to erase the Soviet Union in a single summer. At first it worked. Soviet border armies were caught half awake, their radios cut, their planes burning on the runways. Town after town fell. Prisoners marched west in endless columns that looked from the air like gray ribbons winding through the dust. German commanders believed they were watching an empire collapse. But Russia was not collapsing, it was stretching. Every mile gained pulled the Wehrmacht deeper into a country that seemed to have no center. Supply trucks jolted along broken roads, hundreds of kilometers behind the tanks they were meant to feed. The front moved faster than its own shadow, and that shadow grew longer with every day of advance. Inside the German High Command, a single name dominated the maps: Moscow. The city was the heart of the Soviet system, railways, ministries, command lines, all converging on the Kremlin like arteries to a heart. Capture it, and the body would die. Field Marshals Halder, Bock, and Guderian urged the Führer to strike straight at the capital before the Soviets could recover. Hitler disagreed. He saw Moscow as a prize of prestige, not necessity. Grain and oil were what mattered, he said. The breadbasket of Ukraine, the wells of the Caucasus. Against the advice of his generals, he split his armored spearheads north and south. For the first time since the invasion began, momentum faltered. Through July and August, the front wavered like a loose belt. German tanks fought at Smolensk and Yelnya, bleeding for every mile. The summer sun baked the roads into powder by day, then turned them to sludge when storms rolled in. Trucks clogged the highways, their engines coughing black smoke. Soldiers tore the buttons from their coats to use as makeshift bearings. Even victory began to taste of exhaustion. Far to the east, the Soviets rebuilt. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped beyond the Urals. In Moscow, men dug trenches in the parks while women sewed sandbags in theaters. The air smelled of oil and panic. Stalin stayed silent in public for days, then finally spoke. "Comrades, our cause is just. The enemy will be crushed." By September, the German advance had paused, briefly, fatally. Then came new orders from Berlin. The final drive would begin at once, its code name, Operation Typhoon. The aim was simple: close the last Soviet pockets, reach Moscow before winter, and end the campaign in triumph. For the soldiers who received those orders, the words felt heavy, almost desperate. They had been marching for 3 months, through heat, dust, and endless horizon. Their uniforms hung loose, their machines wheezed with age. But the promise of victory was intoxicating. One more push, they were told, just one. No one yet imagined what waited ahead. The rain that would swallow the roads, the frost that would kill faster than bullets, the city that refused to fall. They thought they were chasing an enemy. In truth, they were walking into a storm that would change the course of the war. Somewhere out there, beyond the haze, Moscow waited. Silent, enormous, unknowable. October 2nd, 1941. The rain had stopped, the air cold and dry. The perfect weather for killing speed. At dawn, the roar of engines broke the stillness across the front. Operation Typhoon had begun. To the men of the Wehrmacht, it was supposed to be the final thrust, the one that would finish the war before the snow. Hitler had promised it himself. After Moscow, the Soviet Union will collapse like a house of cards. Panzer divisions lined the roads, their hulls streaked with mud, their crews hollow-eyed but eager. Ahead lay the capital, less than 300 miles away. Behind them, the ghosts of summer victories already fading. The first blows came fast. Armored columns punched through the Soviet defenses near Vyazma and Bryansk, slicing the front like paper. Luftwaffe bombers struck at rail yards, scattering troop trains before they could unload. Villages vanished under firestorms of artillery. Soviet armies tried to fall back, but there was no back left. Just forest, mud, and confusion. Inside the Red Army's command post, telephones rang without pause. Reports contradicted each other, then went silent altogether. By October 6, 2 massive encirclements had formed, one at Bryansk, one at Vyazma. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops were trapped inside them. The German press called it the death of the Red Army. It seemed the road to Moscow had finally opened. But on the ground, things were already starting to go wrong. The roads, if they could be called roads, had turned to rivers of clay. Trucks bogged down to their axles. Tanks crawled through sludge that swallowed their treads. Rain fell day after day, soaking men, guns, and ammunition. Each vehicle that broke free left another buried behind it. German soldiers learned a new Russian word, Rasputitsa. The season when the land itself became an enemy. Fuel ran low. Horses died in their traces. The front stretched thinner and thinner as units advanced without supply lines to feed them. Some men marched 50 kilometers in a day, only to halt because no food or ammunition could follow. Guderian wrote bitterly in his diary, "The road is a swamp. The machines cannot move. It is as if the earth has swallowed them whole." For the Soviets, this misery was a gift. The delay bought time for reinforcements, for weapons, for new divisions drawn from the heart of the country. Stalin replaced his faltering commanders with men who could act without hesitation. At the center of this effort was Georgy Zhukov, stern, relentless, newly recalled from the defense of Leningrad. He was given one order: save Moscow. In the city, loudspeakers blared military marches to drown out fear. Women and children dug anti-tank trenches in the rain. The smell of wet soil filled the streets. People spoke in whispers about evacuation, about what might happen if the Germans broke through. Every night, trains rumbled east, carrying factories, archives, and families into the interior. And yet Stalin stayed. His presence, more than his words, told the capital that surrender was not an option. Out on the front, the Germans pushed forward inch by inch. From the air, their columns looked unstoppable, rivers of steel and smoke rolling toward the capital. But inside those columns, morale was cracking. Helmets rusted from the rain, rifles jammed with mud. A soldier later wrote, "We thought we were winning, but we were sinking." By mid-October, the Germans had broken through the last outer defenses. Panic spread in Moscow. Government offices burned confidential papers. Roads filled with carts and trucks fleeing east. The city seemed on the verge of collapse. And still, the Wehrmacht came on, hungry, soaked, exhausted, but believing the end was near. No one yet understood that the end was near, for the Blitzkrieg, not for Moscow. The storm that was meant to bring victory was about to turn against its makers. The trap closed like a fist. In the first week of October, two vast encirclements took shape west of Moscow, one around Vyazma, another near Bryansk. Between them, 7 Soviet armies were caught. The German radio called it the greatest victory in history. Photographs showed prisoners trudging through the mud by the tens of thousands, their faces gray with exhaustion, their boots gone. But the victory came at a cost the headlines didn't show. The Wehrmacht was bleeding fuel, time, and strength. Each encirclement that swallowed the Red Army also swallowed the army that created it. Panzers were running dry before they reached the next town. Horses dropped dead where they stood. Trucks groaned under the weight of captured weapons and wounded men. In the forests around Vyazma, Soviet soldiers refused to surrender. They fought from every ridge and village, ambushing convoys, then vanishing into the trees. Some fought for days without orders, living on raw grain scavenged from barns. When the Germans finally reached the battlefield, they found bodies frozen in firing positions, rifles still clutched tight, faces turned toward the road to Moscow. At Bryansk, the story was the same, but crueler. Guderian's tanks cut deep through the southern flank, isolating entire corps. For a moment, it looked like another swift collapse. Then the weather changed. The rain came back heavier than before, turning the open fields into a sucking bog. Engines overheated, treads snapped, and the advance stalled. Soldiers slept standing up because the ground beneath them was water. German officers wired back to headquarters that their units were immobilized. Hitler's response was simple: press on. His generals obeyed, but the logic of Blitzkrieg was unraveling. The farther they went, the slower they moved. The closer they came to Moscow, the less they could see it. For the Soviets, every hour gained was another brick in the city's defense. In Moscow, Zhukov took command of the front and began to rebuild what was left. His army was a patchwork, fresh recruits next to survivors of the summer campaigns. There were shortages of everything except willpower. Factories worked around the clock to arm new divisions. Students were handed rifles still slick with oil, told to head west. By mid-October, the countryside was a blur of movement. Civilians fleeing east, soldiers marching west, smoke rising from fields left burning behind them. The Germans could feel the capital now, close enough that some claimed to see its glow on the horizon at night. They pushed harder. The Red Army bent, broke, and reformed again. When the last pockets around Vyazma fell, it seemed to Hitler that nothing stood between him and victory. But his commanders knew better. Their tanks were crippled, their men half dead from exposure. The roads ahead were clogged with wrecks and corpses. The map said the way was open. The land said otherwise. By late October, the Germans had won themselves into exhaustion. The rain had turned to sleet. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down like a lid. Moscow was less than 100 kilometers away, but for the first time the advance no longer felt like a chase. It felt like endurance. Somewhere beyond the mist, the capital waited. And for the first time, it was ready. Autumn in Russia doesn't arrive quietly. It consumes everything. By late October, the rain fell without pause, heavy and cold, pounding the roads into rivers of sludge. Tires spun helplessly. Engines drowned. The Germans called it the Rasputitsa, the season when the earth itself revolts. Columns that once raced forward now crawled. Trucks buried to their axles. Tanks lurched and stopped, their tracks choking with mud. Horses sank, flailing until they broke their legs. Soldiers stripped the planks from barns and laid them across the muck to drag guns forward a few meters at a time. Every kilometer cost a day. The roads, once arteries of invasion, became veins of failure. The soldiers' uniforms turned the same color as the ground, gray, brown, indistinguishable. They marched knee-deep through water, soaked to the bone, too cold to shiver. Boots rotted on their feet, rifles jammed with grime. A man who slipped might never stand again. The mud could take him whole. And still, the orders came. Advance. Hitler refused to slow down. He raged that the Russians were finished, that a little weather could not stop destiny. But at the front, destiny had a different shape, wet, freezing, and stuck in place. "We no longer fight men," one officer wrote. "We fight the land." For the Soviets, the storm was a reprieve. They used the time to rebuild. In the forest near Moscow, workers dug new trenches and laid minefields by hand. Civilians lined the roads, hauling logs, filling sandbags, building walls of earth and ice. Entire neighborhoods labored with shovels instead of rifles. The defenses grew mile by mile, a chain of desperation stretching toward the capital. Zhukov, newly in command, walked the muddy lines himself. His coat was soaked, his boots caked, his face streaked with rain and exhaustion. But he understood what few did. If Moscow was to live, the front had to hold, even for a week longer. Inside the city, the sound of hammers never stopped. Children carried bricks to barricades. Women dug ditches in the parks. Loudspeakers played patriotic marches over the noise, trying to keep fear at bay. At night, searchlights combed the clouds for bombers that rarely came anymore. The Luftwaffe, too, was grounded by the storm. By the end of October, the German army was no longer an army of conquest. It was an army of survival. The rain had broken its rhythm, and with it, its illusion of control. Food was scarce, fires were forbidden for fear of Soviet aircraft, so men ate frozen bread in the dark. They wrapped themselves in curtains, maps, anything that might hold heat. Then, one morning, the rain stopped. The mud hardened. The soldiers looked up at a sky that had turned white and silent. The air bit at their fingers. The snow had come. They thought for a moment that the worst was over. They were wrong. By the final days of October, Moscow felt like a city holding its breath. Refugees jammed every street. The train stations were chaos, families clutching suitcases, officials waving papers, engines shrieking through the night. The government had already sent archives and ministries east toward the Volga. Even Lenin's embalmed body had been quietly moved from the mausoleum. Everyone expected the next evacuation order to come for Stalin himself. But it never did. His aides urged him to leave. The military argued it was reckless to stay. Stalin listened, silent, smoking in the dim light of his bunker beneath the Kremlin. Then he gave his answer. Moscow will be defended. He wasn't simply refusing to run. He was forcing the country to stand. If he left, morale would collapse. If he stayed, the city might hold. It was less a decision than a gamble with history. Outside, fear turned to grim obedience. Martial law was declared. The NKVD set up roadblocks. Anyone caught fleeing without orders was turned back or shot. In the factories, workers slept beside their machines, producing rifles and shells in 12-hour shifts. The smell of oil, sweat, and metal filled the air. Every spark from the forges felt like defiance. Zhukov arrived from Leningrad and immediately took command of the Western Front. He found an army that barely existed. Exhausted men, scattered units, civilians with shovels. Still, he began to rebuild. Cadets from military academies marched straight to the trenches. Workers formed militias, armed with whatever rifles could be found. Some wore their factory coats into battle. They dug until their hands bled. The line west of the capital became a living wall. In Borodino, where Napoleon had fought more than a century earlier, new trenches cut across the old battlefield. Farmers watched from the woods as artillery shells fell where their ancestors once had stood. It was as if the ghosts of 1812 had risen again, this time armed with machine guns. Inside Moscow, the city changed shape. Statues were wrapped in sandbags. The Red Square disappeared under camouflage nets. The subway tunnels became bomb shelters, filled with thousands of families huddled shoulder to shoulder. At night, they could hear the distant rumble of artillery, each blast a reminder that the front was moving closer. Yet there was a strange calm, too. The city's heartbeat slowed, but it never stopped. The streetcars stopped running, the bakeries did not. Children still went to school, though their classrooms doubled as supply depots. Even the theaters opened occasionally, not for plays, but for patriotic readings and lectures about defense. Every act of normalcy became an act of resistance. Then, in early November, a message arrived from the Far East. Japan would not attack. Stalin's spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, had confirmed it. The eastern border was safe. Within hours, orders went out. Whole divisions of Siberian troops would move west. Hardened men, used to winter, armed for the cold. They would arrive just in time. But in late October, no one knew that yet. To the people of Moscow, the world felt on the verge of ending. German troops were barely 100 kilometers away. You could smell the snow in the air, the iron in the wind. The city was waiting for something, either deliverance or destruction. And beneath the Kremlin, the man who refused to flee listened to the artillery grow louder, cigarette burning down to his fingertips. West of Moscow lay a stretch of land that looked ordinary on a map. Fields, rivers, scattered villages. But in the fall of 1941, it became the thin edge between survival and annihilation. The Mojisk line. It wasn't a wall or a fortress, just a tangle of trenches, wooden bunkers, and anti-tank ditches dug by 500,000 civilians. It had been thrown together in weeks, using shovels, picks, and desperation. When Zhukov arrived to inspect it, he found soldiers without boots, guns without shells, maps that no longer matched the terrain. Yet he didn't waver. If the Germans broke through here, there would be no more Moscow. "We hold," he told his staff, "or we die here." The Germans came first at Borodino, the same ground where Napoleon's army had bled more than a century earlier. The fields were already frozen when the panzers rolled in, the air sharp and brittle. German artillery opened fire, smashing the ridgelines where Soviet divisions crouched. When the bombardment stopped, infantry charged through the smoke. The defenders fired until their barrels glowed, then fought with bayonets when the ammunition was gone. The ground, already soaked from weeks of rain, turned black with soot and blood. Every mile mattered. In the north, the Volokolamsk sector became a graveyard of men and machines. Soviet cadets, boys barely 20, stood against tanks with rifles that jammed in the cold. Some units were wiped out entirely. Yet for every one that fell, another appeared behind it. In the south, near Tula, workers and miners held the city against Guderian's armored spearhead. The Germans reached the suburbs and could go no farther. The winter air smelled of gunpowder and frozen fuel. By mid-November, the Wehrmacht had been advancing for 5 months. Its soldiers were running on exhaustion and myth, the belief that one more push would end everything. Hitler demanded it. "No step back," he ordered, echoing the command he would later despise in his enemies. Von Bock's staff protested that their men could barely stand. Hitler didn't care. Each day became a contest between machine and mud, between will and weather. German tanks froze in place. The oil inside them turned solid. Their crews lit fires beneath the engines to get them running. The Soviets watched from the forests, letting the cold do their work. In Moscow, the rumble of battle was now constant. Windows shook with distant thunder. Civilians measured distance by sound. 10 seconds of echo meant the Germans were still far enough away. Churches had become aid stations. Schools turned into barracks. The city no longer slept. Then, in late November, the first Siberian divisions began to arrive. They stepped off the trains in white camouflage, faces expressionless, rifles wrapped in cloth to keep from freezing. They moved through the city like ghosts, quiet and disciplined. To the weary defenders, they looked like a miracle in human form. Their arrival changed everything. Zhukov now had soldiers who could fight the winter as well as the Germans. He moved them quietly to the front, north to Klin, south to Tula, wherever the line was weakest. These men did not curse the cold. They had lived in worse. By the end of November, the Mojisk line had held for nearly 3 weeks, long enough for the first snow to bury the wreckage, long enough for Moscow to dig deeper and breathe again. The Germans were still moving, but slower, always slower. The city they thought they would take in 10 days had now consumed 2 months of blood and fire. The Germans called it the Battle for Moscow. The Russians called it standing on the bones of the nation. And beneath the snow, those bones were holding. The snow came like a curtain. One night, the sky cleared, and the temperature fell past anything the Germans had imagined. The ground froze solid, hard enough to shatter picks. By dawn, the fields were white and silent, the wrecks of tanks glittering under frost. For a moment, the soldiers thought the cold might be a blessing. The roads were solid again, the mud gone. Then the wind began to cut through their uniforms, and they learned what kind of enemy winter could be. Most of the German army had no winter gear. Hitler hadn't allowed it. He was certain the campaign would end before snow, so they fought in thin coats and summer boots, wrapping themselves in tablecloths, curtains, even newspapers. Oil froze inside engines. Rifle bolts jammed solid. Men huddled together at night, burning fuel meant for tanks just to keep breathing. By morning, many didn't wake. The frost killed without sound. Fingers blackened, boots froze to the ground. Some men tried to keep moving, hoping to stay alive through motion, but their sweat turned to ice beneath their shirts. Commanders wrote reports that sounded less like military briefings and more like diary entries. We have reached the point where the living envy the dead. And still, the orders came. Press forward, no retreat. The goal was Moscow, and it seemed closer than ever. Through binoculars, soldiers could see the faint red glow on the horizon, the reflection of the capital's lights against the clouds. Some believed they could even hear the city. But by then, the army wasn't advancing. It was crawling. Tanks froze mid-turn. Artillery cracked open like eggshells when fired in the cold. Wounded men froze before medics could reach them. The horses were gone. The trucks wouldn't start. Every step forward meant another body left behind in the snow. For the Soviets, the frost was both weapon and deliverance. They had winter coats, felt boots, and white camouflage. They skied across the drifts, struck from the woods, vanished again. Their tanks, T-34s built for the cold, roamed where the German machines lay silent. For the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army had the advantage of movement. Inside Moscow, the air was brittle and clean. The sound of artillery had grown louder, but so had something else: resolve. People lined up for water from frozen pumps, carried logs through the streets, shared bread that had turned to stone. They no longer talked about evacuation. They talked about holding on. Stalin stayed in the city. He met his generals in an unheated office, maps spread across the table, his breath visible in the air. When they told him the Germans were within 15 kilometers, he nodded once and said, "Good, then they will die here." The battle for Moscow was no longer about victory. It was about endurance. 2 armies stood locked in a white wilderness, one burning itself out, the other learning to breathe again. The frost had stopped the Blitzkrieg, and somewhere in the frozen dark, the balance of the war began to shift. Morning, November 7th, 1941. The city was half buried in snow, the air sharp enough to cut skin. Outside the Kremlin walls, drums echoed down Red Square. Soldiers formed ranks in the freezing dawn, breath rising in clouds. It was the anniversary of the October Revolution, 24 years since Lenin's storming of the Winter Palace. Now, with the German army only miles away, Moscow was about to hold a parade. To most of Stalin's generals, it was insanity. The Luftwaffe still prowled the skies. The Germans were close enough to shell the city, yet Stalin insisted the parade go on. The capital needed to see its leader unafraid, standing in the open. He knew fear had become a second enemy, and this was how to fight it. The square was lined with sandbags and anti-aircraft guns. The reviewing stand was draped in camouflage netting. Every soldier who marched carried live ammunition. Most would march straight from Red Square to the front lines outside the city. The speech was brief. Stalin stepped forward, gloved hands on the podium, his coat rimed with frost. "Comrades," he said, his voice steady over the loudspeakers, "our cause is just. The enemy will be destroyed. Let the heroic example of our ancestors guide you." The words were plain, even tired, but the sight of him, standing there while bombs could fall at any moment, changed something. The parade began. Columns of tanks rolled past Lenin's tomb, treads grinding on ice. Cadets and militia marched with bayonets fixed, their boots clattering against the frozen cobblestones. Overhead, the sky remained empty. No planes came. People watched from rooftops and windows, silent except for the sound of the drums. For the men and women of Moscow, that morning was not ceremony. It was defiance, a promise that the city would not die quietly. After the last formation passed, the soldiers turned off Red Square and disappeared into the snow, heading west toward the guns. German reconnaissance pilots reported the parade to their commanders, but Berlin dismissed it as propaganda, a final gesture from a doomed city. They were wrong. Beneath the smoke and frost, Moscow's spirit had hardened. That same week, the first trains from Siberia arrived. At night, their engines hissed steam into the frozen air. The men who stepped off wore fur-lined coats and white camouflage. They spoke little, their faces impassive, their eyes clear. These were veterans of Khalkhin Gol, men who had fought the Japanese in the Far East and survived worse cold than this. They would soon make the front their own. Inside the city, hope flickered like the street lamps burning through the blackout curtains. The Germans were still closing in, but now the Soviets had something they hadn't felt since the war began, a sense that the tide could turn. The people could feel it, even if they didn't yet believe it. As the last tanks left the square, the snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The footprints of the marching columns filled and vanished. The echo of the drums lingered in the cold air long after the parade was gone. The Germans thought Moscow was finished, but that morning, in the heart of a city surrounded by enemies, the Soviet Union had already begun to rise. Through November's darkness, the trains kept coming. From the forests of the Far East to the frozen heart of Russia, they crossed a continent. Their wheels howled on the rails, glowing red from friction, each car packed with men, rifles, and frost. These were the Siberian divisions, 22 of them, summoned from the edge of the world to save Moscow. For months they'd waited under silent orders, guarding the eastern border against Japan. Then came a message from Stalin's spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge. Japan would not attack. The East was safe. Within days, Stalin released his reserve. Entire armies vanished from the Pacific coast and reappeared in the snows outside the capital. They arrived with discipline born of cold. Sheepskin coats, felt boots, padded helmets. Their rifles were clean, their spirits unbroken. They had fought in worse places, against Japanese divisions in the mountains of Manchuria, in winds so cold that breath froze in midair. Compared to that, the road to Moscow seemed almost merciful. When Muscovites saw them stepping off the trains, they stopped and stared. These men did not shuffle or slump like the city's exhausted defenders. They moved in silence, faces unreadable, eyes forward. Children whispered that winter itself had come to fight for them. Zhukov greeted the first units personally. He didn't waste words. He told them where they would go, what they would do, when they would strike. The Siberians nodded once. They understood. For weeks they trained in the forests west of the city. The air was filled with the dull thud of artillery drills, the hiss of skis on snow. They built positions from ice and logs, camouflaged them with whitewash. They waited for the signal to attack. Across the lines, the Germans still believed victory was a matter of days. Their maps showed Moscow close enough to touch. What those maps didn't show was that their armies were collapsing. The men were starving. Frostbitten fingers blackened and fell away. Entire battalions had no ammunition, no fuel. The cold turned weapons into sculptures, rifles that could no longer fire, engines that would never start again. Yet Hitler demanded more. He refused to believe winter had defeated him. His orders were the same: advance. The soldiers obeyed, stumbling forward through blizzards toward a city they would never reach. In those same nights, Soviet scouts moved through the snow like shadows, mapping weak points, marking targets, waiting for the dawn. The new armies were in position now, stretching from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. On December 4th, a final order reached the front: attack at sunrise. The men checked their rifles. They tightened their scarves, their breath white in the air. The wind carried the smell of pine and frozen metal. Somewhere behind them, the faint hum of Moscow's factories rose through the snow. They had been told this was the hour to drive the invaders from the gates. They didn't speak. They simply waited for light. The Germans believed the cold had ended the war. They didn't know it had only changed sides. Dawn, December 5th, 1941. The sky was pale and silent, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Then the ground began to tremble. From Kalinin to Tula, along a front more than 600 kilometers long, the Red Army opened fire. Thousands of guns thundered in unison, their flashes lighting the snow. The counteroffensive had begun. The Siberian divisions moved first, men in white coats and fur-lined hoods gliding over the drifts on skis. They came out of the forest like ghosts, firing as they advanced. German sentries barely had time to sound the alarm before the lines collapsed. For the first time since the war began, the Soviets were the ones attacking. The Germans were stunned. They had believed the enemy was finished, that Moscow was only days from falling. Instead, they faced fresh troops, rested, well-equipped, and perfectly adapted to the cold. Soviet tanks roared forward, T-34s with wide tracks that cut through snow the German panzers could not cross. Infantry followed close behind, bayonets fixed, shouting through the storm. Within hours, the front began to buckle. Around Klin, entire regiments vanished into the blizzard. South of the capital, near Tula, Soviet forces burst through the German flanks, cutting off supply convoys. Panic spread faster than the cold. Field radios jammed with frantic calls for retreat, calls that never came. The German command tried to hold the line. They threw what reserves they had left into the fight: engineers, clerks, cooks. It wasn't enough. Soldiers who had spent weeks freezing in trenches were now fleeing through knee-deep snow, chased by the same enemy they had thought destroyed. Horses bolted, tanks stalled and were abandoned. The once organized columns of the Wehrmacht dissolved into chaos. Zhukov pressed the attack without pause. His orders were simple: push them back, every mile, every hour. The Soviets advanced with a ferocity born of survival. Villages that had been taken and retaken since October were captured again, this time for good. Civilians came out from cellars to greet their liberators, some weeping, others standing in stunned silence. Inside Moscow, people gathered around radios to listen for news. Each announcement felt unreal. "Our troops are advancing," the announcer said. "The Germans are retreating." For months, the city had lived on fear and smoke. Now, for the first time, it could breathe. At the front, the temperature fell even lower, -35, sometimes -40. Guns cracked apart from the cold. Wounded men froze before medics could reach them. But the Red Army kept moving. For them, the cold was no longer an enemy. It was a weapon. The Siberians fought like they were part of the weather itself. By mid-December, the German advance on Moscow was over. Entire divisions were in retreat. Guderian's army fell back from Tula, Hupner's from Klin. The once proud Army Group Center, which had marched halfway across Europe, was now stumbling west in fragments. Hitler refused to believe it. He raged at his generals, accused them of cowardice, and ordered them to stand fast. "Not one step back," he demanded. But his words carried no warmth, no force. The war he had imagined, a war of lightning and momentum, had frozen solid. The counteroffensive didn't just save Moscow. It broke the spell of German invincibility. The Red Army had proved it could stop the Wehrmacht and strike back. In the forests west of the city, the snow buried the wrecks of tanks and the bodies of men. The front line moved, slowly, painfully, but for the first time since June, it moved west. The tide of the war had turned, and it began with the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. By the last weeks of December, the proud Army Group Center was no longer an army. It was a trail of men and machines limping through a white wasteland. The road west was lined with the wreckage of the invasion: burned trucks, frozen horses, shattered helmets half buried in snow. The offensive that was meant to bring victory had become a retreat to stay alive. The Germans were collapsing faster than their high command could comprehend. Soldiers froze standing up, rifles still in their hands. Some had to be pried from their weapons, their fingers locked solid by frost. The wounded begged to be shot rather than left behind. Food convoys vanished in blizzards. Entire companies went missing, swallowed by the storm. Commanders stopped reporting casualties. They no longer had the numbers to count. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the truth was unthinkable. He demanded the impossible: hold every position, fight to the last man, no retreat. When his generals pleaded for permission to withdraw, he accused them of cowardice and betrayal. Guderian, one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg, ignored him and pulled back his troops anyway. Others followed. Within days, Hitler dismissed them all. His wrath couldn't heat a single frozen trench. On the front, the retreat was chaos. Trucks skidded off icy roads. Horses dropped dead in their harnesses. Men abandoned their artillery and stumbled through snow so deep it came to their waists. Soviet aircraft circled above, strafing the columns, and then were gone again, ghosts in the gray sky. For many, there was no difference between enemy fire and the cold, both killed without mercy. The Red Army pressed on, but carefully. Zhukov knew what winter could do even to victors. He pushed his men as far as the supply lines allowed, taking back town after town. Klin, Kalinin, Istra, each one a frozen ruin, filled with the smell of smoke and the silence of the dead. The advance was slow, deliberate, but relentless. Inside those recaptured villages, civilians emerged from cellars and barns, dazed and hollow-eyed. Some had been hiding for months. They stepped out into the snow and stared at the soldiers who had returned. For many, it was the first time they'd seen a friendly uniform since summer. Some wept openly, others just stood, staring at the ruins of what used to be home. By Christmas, the Germans were falling back along a 1,000-kilometer front. The mighty Wehrmacht, unstoppable in Poland, France, and the Balkans, was being driven through the same villages it had conquered only months before. The survivors left behind more than equipment. They left the myth of invincibility that had carried them this far. In Berlin, the propaganda reels kept rolling. Newsreels spoke of tactical withdrawals and temporary setbacks. But in the letters from the front, soldiers told the truth. We are dying in the snow. For the first time since the war began, Germany's war machine had met something it could not outthink, outfight, or outrun. The enemy was not just the Red Army, it was the land itself, the cold, and the belief of a people who refused to yield. When the year ended, the lines on the map looked almost the same as they had before Operation Typhoon began. But for those who had marched toward Moscow and lived to crawl back, everything had changed. The dream of swift conquest had frozen to death somewhere in the fields west of the city. The road that was supposed to lead to victory now led only home, through silence, snow, and the long shadow of defeat. By January 1942, the guns outside Moscow had fallen mostly silent. What remained was the wind, thin, dry, endless, and the creak of frozen metal. Both armies stood facing each other across a landscape of wreckage and graves. The Battle of Moscow was over. The city still stood. The invasion that was meant to destroy the Soviet Union had stopped at its gates and died in the snow. The scale of what had been decided was difficult to see in that moment. For the men who had fought there, it was only exhaustion. The Germans buried their dead in shallow drifts, too frozen to dig deeper. The Soviets hauled their wounded back through the ice, one sled at a time. But history had already shifted. The myth of German invincibility, the belief that no army could resist Blitzkrieg, had been broken. If Moscow had fallen, the Soviet Union might have shattered. Its railways and command networks would have splintered. Its people might have lost the will to fight. But the city endured. It did more than survive. It anchored the whole war effort. Stalin's choice to stay, Zhukov's ruthless defense, the civilians digging trenches with bare hands, all had combined to pull a nation back from the edge. For the Germans, the retreat was more than a defeat. It was the first crack in their empire. Operation Typhoon had cost 500,000 casualties, thousands of vehicles, and the last illusion that speed alone could conquer Russia. Hitler's generals had warned him about the scale of the land, the depth of the cold, the endurance of its people. Now he knew. But his pride would not let him admit it. Even as his armies froze, he was already planning a new campaign, southward, toward the Volga and the oil of the Caucasus. The next name would be Stalingrad. For the Soviets, the cost was even higher. Entire divisions had vanished. More than 1 million soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Villages west of the capital were blackened ruins. The survivors walked among them in silence, burying the dead where they fell. But beneath the grief, something had changed. The Red Army, once fractured and chaotic, had become a machine of endurance. It had learned how to fight the modern war it had been thrown into. Moscow had been its crucible. When Churchill heard the news, he called it the finest defensive battle of the modern age. In Washington, it was the first real sign that the tide could turn. The Allies began to see the Eastern Front not as a doomed resistance, but as the war's decisive theater. For the first time, there was hope that Hitler could be beaten, not someday, but soon. The people of Moscow would remember that winter as a blur of smoke and frost, of hunger and silence, but also of pride. The night the counteroffensive was announced, the city's bells rang again for the first time since the invasion began. Their sound carried through the cold, across streets still covered in barricades and snow, out to the trenches where soldiers listened and smiled in the dark. The battle had lasted 6 months. It had begun in summer dust and ended in frozen dawn. Between them lay everything that defined the Eastern Front: fire, hunger, endurance, and the will to fight no matter the cost. When the thaw finally came and the snow began to melt, the ground revealed what history would remember: the broken tanks, the burned fields, the line where the German advance had stopped forever. Moscow still stood, and with it, so did the hope of the world.